The September wind carved through Bitter Creek like a blade honed on desperation, carrying the metallic taste of approaching snow, and the bitter scent of dreams turned to ash. Serafina Aldrich pressed her back against the canvas wall of her tent, feeling the cold seep through the worn fabric as she rocked her 5-month-old daughter Clara against her chest. The baby's cries had grown weaker over the past 5 days, each sound more thread-like than the last, like whispers from a soul already halfway to heaven. 26 years old, with auburn hair that had once caught lamplight like copper wire, Serafina now wore the hollow-eyed look of a woman who had buried her husband alone in the rocky soil above Arizona's most godforsaken mining camp. Matthew had died when Shaft 3 collapsed 4 weeks ago, crushed beneath tons of rock and timber in what the mine foreman claimed was just another accident, in a place where accidents happen to inconvenient men. She clipped a portable key and sounder across the junction, checked the battery and insulation, then sent the codebook groups in steady rhythm. But Serafina knew better. She had been Matthew's partner. In more than marriage they had worked together, intercepting and routing telegraph messages. And she had heard his final transmission, tapped desperately against the mine walls in the Morse code they both knew by heart. 4 words repeated until silence claimed him. "They killed me, Sarah." For territorial legality, they kept a common law household recognized by church and community, with papers filed before the county clerk and the agency for review. Now Clara was dying too, and Serafina could do nothing but watch. Her own milk had dried up 6 days ago, her body depleted by grief and the meager rations of hardtack and bitter coffee that constituted survival in Bitter Creek. The camp's wells ran thick with mineral runoff that made even water a dangerous gamble. And the nearest source of fresh milk had been Henderson's goat ranch, until Henderson was found with his throat cut 3 months back. "Please, Mrs. Henderson." Serafina had begged the dead man's widow just 2 days ago, Clara limp in her arms. "Just a cup of milk. I can pay when my husband's life insurance comes through." "Insurance?" Mrs. Henderson had laughed a sound like broken glass. "Your husband's cousin already came by about that. Said there wouldn't be any payout on account of Matthew being careless in the mine. Contributory negligence, he called it." The words had struck like a physical blow. Captain James Aldrich, Matthew's only living relative, had been executor of the modest life insurance policy. If he had denied the claim, "You got nothing I need." Mrs. Henderson had continued, her face hard as the granite peaks surrounding them. "Best find yourself a man quick or start digging graves for 2 instead of 1. She had tried Dr. Monroe next, swallowing what remained of her pride. "Doctor, surely there's something a wet nurse, a woman in the camp who might spare some milk for a baby?" Monroe had looked at Clara with professional detachment, noting the blue tinge to her lips, the way her tiny fists had stopped clenching with hunger, and now lay open in exhausted surrender. "Mrs. Aldrich, I'll be direct. Your daughter has perhaps 1 day left, maybe 2 if she's exceptionally strong. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do without proper nourishment." The truth was a knife between her ribs, but Serafina had thanked him and walked home through the muddy streets of a camp that had already written them both off as inevitable casualties. That evening, as cook fires flickered like dying stars between the tents and ramshackle buildings, Serafina held Clara close and sang the lullabies her own mother had sung in Missouri. Before the war changed everything, before Matthew's restless dreams had carried them west to this place where hope came to die. "Hush now, my darling," she whispered, though her voice cracked with exhaustion. "Mama's here. Mama won't leave you." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were lies. Death was coming for Clara, patient and implacable, and all of Serafina's love couldn't turn it back. That was when she noticed the tracks. Fresh prints in the muddy ground circled her tent at a careful distance, not the heavy boots of miners or the neat shoes of camp women, but moccasins moving with deliberate quiet. The prince led away toward the dark bulk of the Dragoon Mountains, where Apache territory stretched into wilderness that white men entered at their peril. Serafina's breath caught. Apache raiders had struck isolated claims before leaving bodies that bore the marks of old hatred and fresh desperation. But as she turned back toward her tent, her heart nearly stopped. A clay bowl sat on the wooden crate beside her door, steam rising from its contents like incense from an altar. Warm goat's milk, rich and white enough to fill Clara's desperate stomach. The bowl had materialized as silently as morning mist placed there by hands she had not seen. Movement caught her eye at the edge of the lamplight. A figure stood in the shadows between two abandoned ore cars, tall and broad-shouldered with long black hair bound by what looked like a leather thong. Even in the darkness, she could make out the glint of beadwork and the weathered buffalo hide that hung from his shoulders like armor earned through survival. Their gazes met across the space between despair and deliverance. His eyes held hers steadily, without threat, but without submission either. This was the look of a man who had measured death and found it wanting, who had learned to read danger in the set of shoulders and the angle of hands. Serafina felt something shift inside her chest, not fear, though fear would have been reasonable, but recognition. Here was another soul carved hollow by loss, another survivor carrying the weight of grief too heavy for one person to bear alone. The stranger raised two fingers to his lips in a gesture for silence, then stepped backward into darkness with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed by shadows themselves. Within heartbeats, he had vanished as completely as if he had been born from the desert wind and returned to it. Serafina knelt beside the bowl, testing the milk with a trembling finger. It was warm, fresh, untainted by the bitter minerals that poisoned everything else in this cursed valley. Clara's cries grew more urgent, tiny mouth working frantically as the scent of salvation reached her. Without hesitation, Serafina carried both bowl and baby inside, settling by her small oil lamp to feed her daughter. As the warm milk touched Clara's lips, color began returning to the pale skin, and the baby's desperate sucking gradually gave way to the satisfied rhythm of a child whose prayers had been answered by a stranger's mercy. As Clara fed a glowing ember from the nearby slag heap, caught the wind, and landed on the tent flap, Serafina stamped it out with her boot, while holding Clara close, realizing how fragile their salvation remained. Fire-cold starvation disease, a dozen deaths waited just beyond the canvas walls. When she looked outside again, the stranger was gone, but his tracks remained in the mud, leading toward Apache country like a promise written in footprints and sealed with milk that had saved her daughter's life. For the first time in days, Clara slept peacefully, but Serafina lay awake staring at the tent ceiling and wondering what price would be asked for this miracle, and whether she could afford to pay it. The next morning brought another bowl, and the morning after that. Each time the milk appeared as silently as dawn left by hands. She never saw, though she had begun watching from her tent flap through the darkest hours before sunrise. Whoever her benefactor was, he moved like smoke through a world that seemed solid only to less careful observers. Clara began to thrive, her cheeks filling out, strength returned to her tiny limbs. But with each passing day, Serafina's debt to the unknown, Apache, grew heavier, and she knew that debts in the territory were always collected one way or another. On the morning of the 6th day, as she knelt to retrieve the bowl, Serafina heard the approach of horses and voices she recognized. She straightened quickly, clutching Clara against her chest, as 3 riders emerged from between the tents. Serafina. The voice was warmly familiar, carrying the authority of family and military rank. Captain James Aldrich dismounted with the fluid grace of a career officer, his blue uniform immaculate despite the long ride from Camp Grant. Behind him came Sergeant Collins and Private Martinez, both armed and alert. James. Serafina forced a smile, though something cold was forming in her stomach. What brings you all this way? Matthew's cousin was a handsome man in his early 30s with the sharp features and pale eyes that marked the Aldrich bloodline. His smile seemed genuine as he approached, arms extended as if to embrace her. Word reached me about your difficulties. Apache activity in the area, mysterious visitors in the night. His expression grew grave. I came as soon as I could arrange leave. You and Clara shouldn't be facing these dangers alone. We're managing well enough. Serafina replied carefully, noting how his gaze lingered on the milk bowl still warm in her hands. Are you? Aldrich's tone carried the gentle authority of a man accustomed to making decisions for others. Serafina, you can't seriously expect to raise a child in this godforsaken place, especially with hostile Indians prowling around your tent. He gestured to his men, who began unloading supplies from their pack animals, canned goods, flour, coffee, and other provisions that would have seemed like treasure just days ago. I've brought supplies to tide you over until we can arrange more permanent accommodations. There's a position available at Camp Grant, working with the telegraph office. The pay is modest but steady, and Clara would have proper care. The offer should have been a relief salvation offered by family when all other doors had closed. But something in Aldrich's pale eyes, some calculation behind the familial concern, made Serafina's skin crawl. That's very generous, James, but I haven't decided what we'll do yet. Of course. These decisions shouldn't be rushed. His smile never wavered, but his gaze kept returning to the bowl in her hands. Though, I confess I'm troubled by reports of Apache's sign around your tent. The territorial authorities are offering substantial bounties for information about hostile activity. I wouldn't know anything about that, Serafina said evenly. No, I'm sure you wouldn't. Aldrich's tone suggested he believed otherwise. But if you should notice anything unusual, visitors who shouldn't be here, communications that seem out of place, I hope you'll remember that family looks after family. As the soldiers finished unloading supplies, Serafina noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among Aldrich's personal effects was a leather case containing expensive cigars, the kind imported from Cuba at considerable cost. She had seen similar cigars before. Matthew had found one near the mine entrance the day before he dyed expensive tobacco that had no business being in the possession of ordinary miners. We'll be staying in camp for a few days. Aldrich continued, oblivious to her observation. Long enough to ensure your safety and help you make the right decisions about your future. After they left, Serafina sat in her tent, holding Clara, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind. The denied insurance claim. The convenient timing of Matthew's death, just as he had been asking uncomfortable questions about mine ownership and army contracts. And now, James Aldrich himself appearing with supplies and protection that felt more like surveillance. That evening brought no bowl of milk, no sign of her mysterious benefactor. Clara fussed hungrily, and Serafina found herself rationing the canned milk from Aldrich's supplies, afraid to trust it completely, but having no other choice. It wasn't until the third night after Aldrich's arrival that the bowl reappeared, along with something else, a small piece of paper tucked beneath the clay rim. The message was brief and written in careful script, danger close. Must talk. Tomorrow night when moon sets. Follow Hawk call north of Stamp Mill. Come alone. Serafina stared at the paper by lamplight, her heart racing. The mysterious Apache had been watching, had seen Aldrich's arrival, and recognized the threat it represented. But meeting him would mean leaving Clara alone, vulnerable to whatever plans her cousin-in-law might have. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Aldrich visited twice, each time more insistent about the need for her to accept his protection and relocate to Camp Grant. His questions grew more pointed, probing what she might know about Matthew's final days, whether her husband had left any papers or personal effects that might need safekeeping. Matthew was always meticulous about his records. Aldrich observed during his afternoon visit, examining the simple furnishings of her tent with professional thoroughness. Telegraph operators have to be, of course. I'd hate for any important documents to be lost or fall into the wrong hands. I'm afraid most of his papers were buried with him. Serafina lied smoothly. In truth, Matthew's codebooks and personal notes were hidden beneath their mattress, wrapped in oilcloth, along with his portable telegraph equipment. Of course. Though, if you should remember anything, any communications that seemed unusual in his final days. Aldrich's pale eyes fixed on hers with uncomfortable intensity. Family should share such burdens. That evening, Serafina fed Clara from the mysterious milk and settled her daughter in the basket that served as a cradle. Miss Klein, the camp's schoolteacher, had agreed to watch over the tent, while Serafina attended to personal business, asking no questions with the discretion of a woman who understood that survival sometimes required secrets. The hawk's cry came just after midnight, wild and lonely against the desert silence. Serafina wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the darkness, following the sound north, past the broken stamp mill to where moonlight painted the rocks silver and black. He was waiting in a natural shelter formed by wind-carved sandstone, a small fire burning in a ring of stones. Up close, she could see his face, clearly weathered copper skin stretched over high cheekbones, dark eyes that held depths of carefully controlled pain, and the lean build of a man who had learned to live on what the land provided, and nothing more. "You came," he said simply. His English carried the formal precision of someone who had learned the language from missionaries and soldiers, each word carefully chosen. "You saved my daughter's life. 6 times now." Serafina remained standing, her hand near the derringer in her skirt pocket. "I think I have the right to know who you are and what you want. My name is Dakota. I was White Mountain Apache, then Army Scout, now neither." He gestured toward the mountains with a movement that encompassed both exile and acceptance. "I live alone, tend goats that belong to a dead man, try to survive without bringing more death to the world. And you've been watching us. You saw my husband's cousin arrive. I saw soldiers come to your tent, men with questions about Apache, sign about mysterious gifts." Dakota's expression darkened. "Men who smell of lies and old blood." The phrase sent a chill down Serafina's spine. "What do you mean by old blood?" "Your husband's cousin, I've seen him before. At Aravepa Canyon 2 years ago when the Army came to relocate peaceful families." Dakota's voice grew quiet, heavy with memory. "He was there when my wife and son were killed. Stood by and watched while soldiers shot women holding babies." Serafina felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "That's impossible. James is family. He came to Matthew's funeral, spoke about duty and honor. He spoke lies to cover greater lies." Dakota reached into his buffalo robe and withdrew a leather portfolio containing what looked like official documents. "I was scouting for the Army, then believed their promises of protection for those who cooperated. When I saw what they did to innocents, I took these papers and disappeared into the mountains. The documents revealed detailed military communications, supply schedules, and patrol routes throughout the territory. But more importantly, they showed a pattern of coordination between Army operations and civilian interests. Names appeared repeatedly, Aldrich Vetch mine owners and territorial officials working together to clear valuable land through forced relocations and convenient accidents. Your husband discovered this conspiracy. Dakota continued. His telegraph work let him intercept communications that weren't meant for outside eyes. When he began asking questions, They killed him. The words came out as barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of certainty. James denied his insurance claim, said it was contributory negligence, but it was murder. Murder made to look like accident, like so many others. Dakota rolled the papers carefully. But now they have a new problem. Apache families near Camp Grant are scheduled for relocation in 8 days. A false message could delay that operation, give people time to scatter safely. Serafina stared at him in the flickering firelight, processing the implications. You want me to forge military communications? I want you to help me save lives. Children who don't deserve to die for white men's greed. His dark eyes reflected the flames as he studied her face. But I also want to help you survive what's coming. Your cousin will not leave empty-handed. He came here for a reason. The truth of it settled in her stomach like ice water. Aldrich's sudden appearance, his pressing offers of protection, his pointed questions about Matthew's papers, it all pointed to a man trying to eliminate loose ends before they could unravel his carefully constructed conspiracy. What exactly would you need me to do? There's a relay station 3 miles north of camp. The operator drinks heavily after his evening transmission. You could connect your husband's portable equipment, send a delay order using the proper authentication codes. And if we're caught, then we die knowing we tried to save innocents instead of letting them be slaughtered for profit. Dakota's smile was grim but determined. I've been carrying death inside me for 2 years since my family was murdered. At least this death would have meaning. The pain in his voice resonated with something deep in Serafina's chest. Here was grief that matched her own loss, that had carved similar hollow spaces in 2 different hearts. But where her tragedy was recent and raw, his had been seasoned by time into quiet, determined fury. Tell me about them, she said softly. Your wife and son. Dakota was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something precious. Ayana. It means eternal blossom in our language. We were married 4 years, had a son named Nalnish, he who works. Smart boy, always asking questions about everything he saw. Dakota stared into the fire, seeing faces in the flames. When the army came to relocate our band, I was away scouting. I believed their promises that cooperation would keep families safe. His hands gradually clenched into fists. I returned to find the camp burned bodies left for scavengers. Ayana had tried to shield our son. I found them together, her arms still around him. His voice broke on the last words. The commanding officer said it was regrettable but necessary. The price of progress. Serafina reached out instinctively, covering his fisted hands with her own. His skin was warm despite the cool night air, scarred by years of hard living, but steady as granite. I'm sorry, she whispered, meaning it more than any condolence she had ever offered. Sorrow doesn't resurrect the dead. Dakota replied, but he didn't pull his hands away. Only action can prevent more death. Only stopping the men who profit from suffering can give meaning to loss. They sat in silence, 2 people bound by parallel tragedies, finding unexpected comfort in shared understanding. Around them, the desert night pressed close, full of sounds that spoke of life continuing. Despite human cruelty, the rustle of small creatures, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through ancient stone. I'll help you, Serafina said finally. Not just for the Apache families, but for Matthew. He died trying to expose this conspiracy. The least I can do is finish what he started. And for Clara. So she grows up in a world where children aren't murdered for adults' profit. Dakota's smile transformed his weathered face, revealing the man he might have been if the world had shown him more mercy. Tomorrow night, then. Can you leave the baby safely? Miss Klein has helped before. She won't ask questions. Serafina stood wrapping her shawl against the desert cold. But Dakota, if something happens to me, if we're caught, promise me you'll look after Clara. Don't let her become another casualty. I promise, he said solemnly, though I pray we'll both live to see her grow up free. As Serafina walked back toward camp, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Matthew's death purpose. Not the desperate struggle of a woman trying to keep her child alive one more day, but the steady determination of someone who had found an ally in the fight against forces that seemed too large for any individual to challenge. Behind her, Dakota watched until she disappeared into the maze of tents and shadows, then began making his own preparations for what might be their last night alive. But for the first time in 2 years, the prospect of death didn't seem like a release from suffering. It seemed like an interruption of something precious that was just beginning to grow. The relay station squatted on a wind-scoured ridge like a wooden scar against the star-filled sky, its telegraph poles black crosses against the Milky Way. Serafina and Dakota approached through scattered boulders and twisted juniper, moving with the careful silence of people who understood that discovery meant death. Clara slept peacefully in Miss Klein's care-fed and content for the first time in weeks. The teacher had asked no questions when Serafina brought the baby over, merely nodded and made space in her small tent for the additional occupant. Some kindnesses were offered without explanation or expectation of reward. There, Dakota whispered, pointing to the small building where a single lamp burned behind dirty glass. Through the window, they could see the operator hunched over his key, tapping out routine communications with the mechanical precision of long practice. He'll drink himself senseless within the hour. It's his nightly ritual. How long will I need? Serafina clutched Matthew's equipment wrapped in oilcloth, the familiar weight of the portable relay keys solid against her hip. 15 minutes to make the connection and send the message. Perhaps 20 if the contacts need cleaning. Dakota's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to planning dangerous operations. But if he wakes, if he raises an alarm, he won't wake, Serafina replied with confidence, born from weeks of watching the operator's habits. That man drinks like he's trying to drown something that won't stay buried. They waited until the lamp dimmed and wavering shadows suggested the operator had collapsed over his bottle. Then they crept to the rear of the building, where a loose board provided access to the junction box that controlled the telegraph lines. Working by touch in absolute darkness, Serafina connected Matthew's relay to the main trunk line. Her husband had taught her this skill during their courting days in Missouri, patient lessons that had seemed romantic then, but proved crucial now. The equipment was delicate, requiring precise adjustments to avoid detection by operators at distant stations. "Ready," she whispered. Dakota nodded and then settled into position where he could watch for approaching searchers while keeping the building's entrance in view. His Spencer rifle lay across his knees, loaded and ready for whatever trouble their actions might bring. The key clicked softly as Serafina tapped out the carefully prepared message. "Postpone sweep operation. Stop supply difficulties. Requires 72-hour delay. Stop await further instructions. Stop Captain J. Aldrich, commanding stop." She signed it with authentication codes copied from the documents Dakota had stolen, then held her breath as the reply came crackling back through the copper wires. The distant operator at Camp Grant acknowledged receipt and confirmed the delay, apparently accepting the forgery without suspicion. "Done." She breathed, disconnecting the equipment with hands that trembled from tension rather than cold. But as they prepared to slip away into the darkness, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the ridge. Not the random movement of wild stock, but the disciplined cadence of riders, moving with military purpose. "Company, Coke." Dakota warned, pulling Serafina deeper into the shadows, behind a jumble of granite boulders. The search party emerged from the night like hunting wolves' torches held high to illuminate the ground as they followed tracks that led inevitably toward the relay station. At their head rode Captain Aldrich himself, his pale eyes reflecting torchlight as he directed the hunt with cold efficiency. "Spread out, men. Whoever sent that false message is still in the area, and they've left sign we can follow." His voice carried across the night air with military precision. $50 to whoever brings me the Apache alive. 25 for proof of his accomplice. Serafina's blood turned to ice water. Somehow Aldrich had discovered their deception almost immediately, which meant he had been monitoring communications more closely than they had realized. The trap was closing around them with mechanical inevitability. Dakota's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and steady, despite the mortal danger surrounding them. For a moment, suspended between terror and something else entirely, they pressed close together while death prowled just yards away. She could smell leather and wood smoke on his clothing, feel the controlled strength in his grip as he prepared to fight their way clear if necessary. "This way," he whispered, leading her through a maze of stone outcroppings toward a steep-sided arroyo that would hide their movement from the searchers' torches. They slipped away like smoke, leaving the frustrated search party to comb empty ground, while their quarry vanished into country that Dakota knew better than any white man alive. But behind them, Serafina could hear Aldrich's voice raised in fury as he realized how completely he had been outmaneuvered. "Find them," he snarled at his men. "I don't care if you have to search every cave and canyon from here to Mexico. They're not getting away with this." The words carried the weight of personal vendetta, confirming what Serafina had already begun to suspect. This was about more than military operations or territorial politics. This was about family betrayal, about secrets that could destroy careers and reputations if they ever saw daylight. As they made their way through darkness toward whatever sanctuary Dakota could provide, Serafina felt her old life falling away, like a snake shedding skin. The frightened widow, counting days until starvation claimed her child was dying, replaced by someone harder and more determined. A woman who had found purpose in fighting back against forces that treated human lives like counters in a game of profit and loss. "Where are we going?" she asked as they climbed through scrub oak and manzanita toward higher ground. "Somewhere safe. A place where my people sheltered during the worst of the wars." Dakota's voice carried quiet confidence despite their desperate circumstances. "But it means leaving everything behind, living rough until the danger passes." Serafina thought of her tent, her few remaining possessions, and the last tangible connections to her life with Matthew. All of it seemed suddenly fragile, temporary, as morning mist against the solid reality of survival. "Clara needs her parents more than she needs permanent address," she said, surprising herself with a certainty in her voice. The word parents hung between them in the darkness, unplanned, but somehow inevitable. Dakota's grip on her hand tightened momentarily, acknowledging the truth of what had been growing between them through weeks of shared danger and mutual dependence. "Before dawn," he said, "we collect Clara and disappear into country where soldiers fear to follow." As they climbed toward the hidden places where Apache families had sheltered for generations, Serafina felt something she hadn't experienced since Matthew's death hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning woman grabbing for driftwood, but the steady hope of someone who had found allies in the fight against overwhelming odds. Behind them, torches flickered like angry stars as Aldrich's search party combed the valley floor. But ahead lay sanctuary, and beyond that, the possibility of building something new from the ashes of everything they had lost. The hidden canyon nestled in the heart of the Dragoon Mountains like a secret held close by ancient stone, its walls rising sheer and red toward a narrow strip of sky. Apache families had sheltered here during the worst of the reservation wars, leaving behind only rock paintings and the careful arrangements of stones that marked sacred ground. Dakota's camp occupied a grove of massive cottonwoods, beside a spring of sweet water with grass for the goats he had liberated from Henderson's abandoned ranch and caves for shelter when the weather turned harsh. It was a place invisible to white eyes, that looked without truly seeing, protected by terrain that would challenge even experienced trackers. For 3 weeks they lived like a family fleeing the end of the world, and in many ways they were. Clara thrived in the clean mountain air, her cheeks filling out as regular feeding restored strength to her tiny frame. She babbled constantly now, mixing English and Apache words that Dakota taught her, while Serafina learned skills she had never imagined needing. How to move through brush without leaving sign. How to read weather in the color of distant peaks. How to distinguish between the territorial calls of hawks and the warning cries of men imitating bird sounds. But beyond survival skills, she was learning about the man who had saved her daughter's life. Dakota was endlessly patient with Clara, speaking to her in Apache, while teaching her to recognize different animal tracks and bird calls. He carved wooden toys from mountain oak and wove willow baskets for her amusement, his scarred hands gentle as he guided tiny fingers in tracing the shapes of horses and eagles. "She learns quickly," he observed one evening, as Clara pulled herself upright, using his knee for support. "Like her mother, this child will survive whatever the world brings. She has excellent teachers." Serafina replied, then felt warmth rise in her cheeks at the implications of her words. They had been dancing around the growing intimacy between them for days, neither quite ready to name what was developing in the spaces between shared meals and quiet conversations by the fire. The nights were cold at elevation, requiring them to share blankets and body warmth, while Clara slept peacefully between them. Domestic routines had evolved naturally. Serafina would feed the baby, while Dakota cleaned his rifle or mended gear, partnership tasks that spoke of something deeper than mere cooperation. "Tell me about Matthew," Dakota said one night as they watched stars emerge above the canyon rim. "What manner of man was he?" Serafina was quiet for a long moment, remembering her husband's laugh, his patient way of explaining telegraph protocols, his dreams of making enough money to buy land in California where they could raise Clara safely. He was good. He was honest to a fault which made him dangerous to men like Vetch and Aldrich. She adjusted Clara in her lap, the baby drowsing contentedly after her evening feeding. Matthew believed the world could be improved through hard work and fair dealing. It took me weeks to accept that such beliefs had gotten him killed. Believing in justice doesn't make a man naive, Dakota said carefully. It makes him necessary. The world needs people who refuse to accept cruelty as inevitable. Is that why you're helping us? Because you believe in justice? Dakota poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. When he finally answered, his words came slowly, as if he was discovering them himself. At first, it was because seeing Clara hungry reminded me of my son. I couldn't bear the thought of another child dying while I did nothing to prevent it. He looked at her directly, firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. But now it's because I care what happens to both of you. More than I thought I could care about anyone again. The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Serafina felt her heart beating faster, aware that they were approaching territory that would change everything. "Caring is dangerous," she said softly. "It gives the world new ways to hurt you. Everything worthwhile carries risk." Dakota's voice was steady, certain. "The question is whether the reward justifies the danger." Before Serafina could find words to respond, Clara stirred in her sleep and began fussing. As they both moved to comfort her, their hands brushed over the baby's blanket. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent warmth shooting up Serafina's arm like lightning through copper wire. "She's warm." Dakota observed his fingers lingering against Clara's forehead. Perhaps too warm. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of worry and careful nursing as Clara fought off a fever that left her listless and refusing food. Serafina barely slept, taking turns with Dakota to bathe the baby's face with cool water and coax her to drink small amounts of milk. "Will she?" Serafina couldn't finish the question that haunted her darkest hours. "She's strong," Dakota replied with quiet confidence. "And she has parents who won't give up fighting for her." The word parents came naturally now, no longer startling in its implications. Somewhere during the long nights of shared vigil, they had stopped being strangers bound by temporary alliance and become something more permanent. A family forged by necessity, perhaps, but strengthened by choice. On the 4th morning, Clara's fever broke. She woke hungry and demanding, her lusty cries echoing off the canyon walls like music celebrating victory over death. As Serafina fed her daughter, she found Dakota watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What?" she asked. "I was thinking how different things might have been," he said quietly. "If my son had lived, if Ayana hadn't died protecting him. Would I have been as good a father as Matthew was to Clara? Would I have taught him the things he needed to know?" "You're teaching her now," Serafina replied. "Clara may not remember her birth father, but she'll grow up knowing a man who risked everything to keep her safe. That's what fathers do, they protect their children no matter the cost." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, processing the gift she had just given him. Then he reached out and gently touched Clara's hand where it rested on her mother's arm. The baby's fingers closed around his thumb with instinctive trust, and something settled into place in his expression. "Then I accept the responsibility," he said solemnly, "and the joy that comes with it." That evening, as they sat together watching the last light fade from the western sky, Serafina made a decision that had been growing in her heart for days. "Dakota," she said carefully, "when this is over, when the danger passes, what will you do?" "I don't know. The army doesn't want me back, and my own people consider me outcast for refusing the path of endless revenge." He was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps I'll stay in the high country, tend goats, and try to live quietly where no one asks questions about the past. Alone. I've been alone for 2 years. A man grows accustomed to solitude after a while." But his voice carried undertones of longing that suggested solitude was a burden rather than a choice. Serafina studied his profile in the dying light, seeing strength and gentleness in equal measure, recognizing the man who had risked everything to feed a hungry baby simply because it was the right thing to do. "It doesn't have to be that way," she said softly. "Clara and we're going to need help building a new life. Someone who knows this country, who understands what it takes to survive. Someone we can trust completely." Dakota turned to look at her directly, hope flickering in his dark eyes, like the first star appearing in twilight. "You're offering partnership. I'm offering family." Serafina replied, the word coming easily because it felt more right than anything she had said in months. "If you want it. If you think you could stand being tied down to a widow and her baby." The answer came not in words, but in action as Dakota gently took her free hand in both of his. His palms were warm and calloused from hard work, scarred by years of violence, but infinitely gentle as they cradled her fingers. "I would be honored," he said formally, then smiled with warmth that transformed his weathered features. Both terrified and honored if I'm being completely honest. Clara chose that moment to voice her opinion on the proceedings, making pleased sounds that might have been laughter or simple contentment. She seemed to approve of the arrangement, reaching toward both adults with chubby arms as if claiming them as her own. They might have sat there until full darkness fell, three people discovering what it meant to be a family, but the sound of approaching horses echoed up the canyon walls like thunder before a storm. Not the random movement of wild stock, but the disciplined advance of many riders moving with deadly purpose. "How many?" Serafina whispered, gathering Clara protectively against her chest. Dakota was already on his feet, rifle in hand, as he counted muzzle flashes in the gathering dusk. 20, maybe more. Full military patrol with civilian scouts. Aldrich. Leading them personally from the sound of his voice. Dakota's expression was grim as he calculated odds that heavily favored their pursuers. Someone found our trail, guided them through country that should have turned back any white man. The betrayal stung, but there was no time for anger. Serafina wrapped Clara warmly and gathered their few essential possessions, while Dakota saddled the horses and loaded his rifle with grim efficiency. "Where can we go?" she asked. "If they found this place, if they have guides who know Apache trails." "There's one more sanctuary." Dakota said, his voice heavy with memory. "The old mine workings above Bitter Creek. Dangerous ground, but Apache families hid there during the worst times. If we can reach it before they cut us off." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off canyon walls like the drumbeat of approaching doom. But even as they prepared to run for their lives, Serafina felt no regret for the choice they had made. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as a family. "Then we go," she said simply. "All of us. Together." Dakota's smile was fierce and proud as he helped her mount her horse, Clara secure in her arms. "Together," he agreed. Now and always. They rode out of paradise into uncertain darkness, three people bound by love that had grown from desperate necessity into something far stronger than the forces arrayed against them. Behind them, torches flickered like angry stars as their pursuers closed in. But ahead lay their final sanctuary, and beyond that, whatever future they could forge from hope and determination. The abandoned mine workings above Bitter Creek stretched through the mountainside like the fossilized remains of some great beast, tunnels and shafts carved from living rock by men who had dreamed of silver and found only darkness. Apache families had sheltered here during the worst of the reservation wars, but even they approached this place with caution. Too many miners had died in cave-ins and gas explosions for the ground to feel entirely safe. Dakota led them through passages he had mapped during his scouting days when Army officers had wanted to know every cave and hiding place in Apache country. The irony wasn't lost on him that knowledge gained in service to the Army now served to protect those the Army hunted. "Stay close," he warned as they navigated a particularly treacherous section where loose rock threatened to cascade at the slightest vibration. "This mountain is riddled with old workings, some stable, others ready to collapse at a harsh word." Clara had grown quiet in her mother's arms, perhaps sensing the tension that surrounded them, or simply awed by the echoing spaces that swallowed their whispers and gave them back as ghostly murmurs. Serafina found herself counting heartbeats, measuring their progress through a landscape that felt more like a tomb than a refuge. "Here," Dakota said finally, leading them into a natural cavern that intersected with the mine workings. Water seeped from the walls to form a small pool, and ancient smoke stains on the ceiling showed where other fugitives had dared to build fires in this hidden place. They had barely settled Clara in a nest of blankets when the sound of pursuit echoed from the tunnel mouth behind them. Voices carried strangely in the confined spaces, distorted by rock and distance, but unmistakably growing closer. "Spread out, but stay together," came Aldrich's voice, tight with the authority of a man whose careful plans were finally bearing fruit. They can't have gone far with a baby to slow them down. Dangerous ground, Captain. Another voice replied, one of the civilian scouts, by his accent. These old workings are unstable. One wrong step could bring the whole mountain down. Then we'll be careful, Aldrich snapped. But we're not leaving empty-handed. Not when we're this close to ending this inconvenience permanently. Dakota checked his rifle and counted ammunition with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that surviving impossible odds required attention to every detail. 20 rounds for the Spencer, plus his sidearm and the long knife that had saved his life more than once. Against 20 armed men, it should have been hopeless. But the mine workings changed the equation. Narrow passages limited their enemy's ability to use superior numbers, while Dakota's knowledge of the terrain gave him advantages that military training couldn't match. There's another passage deeper in the mountain, he whispered to Serafina. It connects to the old stamp mill foundations, gives us a way out if this position becomes untenable. But it means leaving the horses. Then we leave them. Serafina's voice was steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. Clara matters more than anything else. The first exchange of gunfire came when Aldrich's advance scouts reached the main cavern, and their lanterns creating dancing shadows that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Dakota's Spencer boomed in the confined space, the heavy bullet taking one scout center mass and sending him crashing into his companions. But the return fire was immediate, and overwhelming muzzle flashes, strobing like lightning, while bullets sparked off stone walls and ricocheted through the darkness with deadly unpredictability. Clara began crying her wails, adding to the chaos as Serafina pressed deeper into the shadows with their daughter clutched against her chest. "Fall back," Dakota ordered, already moving toward the deeper passage he had mentioned. The sound will draw them like wolves to wounded prey. They retreated through passages that grew progressively narrower, forcing their pursuers to advance single file, while Dakota used his superior knowledge of the terrain to set ambushes and slow their pursuit. But with each exchange of gunfire, their ammunition dwindled while their enemies seemed inexhaustible. "Captain," came a voice from behind them, echoing strangely through the rock passages. "Found something you need to see?" The pursuit halted, giving them precious minutes to put distance between themselves and their hunters. But when Aldrich's voice came again, it carried a note of cold satisfaction that chilled Serafina's blood. "Mrs. Aldrich." He called his words bouncing off stone walls to reach them wherever they might be hiding. "I know you can hear me. I have something that belongs to you." The sound that followed made Serafina's heart stop, Clara's wicker basket being rattled, creating the distinctive sound she would recognize anywhere. In their haste to retreat, they had left behind the nest of blankets where Clara usually slept, along with her few toys and the spare clothes that were all she owned in the world. "Clever little thing, isn't it?" Aldrich continued his voice, carrying the casual cruelty of a cat playing with wounded prey. "The basket, I mean? Perfect size for a baby with all her little belongings. Of course, it would be a shame if something happened to it. If it were to fall down one of these convenient mine shafts, for instance." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Serafina felt rage building in her chest, like a bonfire fed with dry timber. But Dakota's hand on her arm kept her from doing something foolish. "He's trying to provoke us into making mistakes," he whispered. "Don't give him that advantage. But if he destroys her things, then we'll make new things. Clara needs her parents alive more than she needs any possession." Dakota's voice carried quiet authority. "Trust me, I've been hunted before." They continued deeper into the mountain, following passages that grew so narrow They had to move single file through spaces carved by water over geological ages. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe heavy, with the weight of stone pressing down from above. Behind them, the pursuit resumed with renewed vigor, driven by Aldrich's determination to eliminate the witnesses who could destroy his carefully constructed conspiracy. But the deeper passages played havoc with their enemies' coordination, forcing them to rely on lantern light that made them perfect targets while revealing nothing of their quarry. Dakota used this advantage ruthlessly, setting up ambushes at natural choke points, where a single well-placed shot could hold off multiple attackers. His rifle spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and economical in its lethality. But ammunition was finite, and their enemies seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of both men and bullets. "How much farther?" Serafina asked during a brief lull in the fighting, Clara mercifully quiet in her arms, despite the chaos surrounding them. "Not far. The passage opens into the old stamp mill foundations within a few hundred yards." Dakota reloaded his rifle with practiced efficiency. But it's the most dangerous part of the route. The ceiling is supported by timber that's been rotting for years. As if summoned by his words, a low rumble echoed through the mountain, the sound of stressed wood finally giving way under impossible weight. Somewhere behind them, part of the mine workings had collapsed, hopefully taking some of their pursuers with it, but also blocking their retreat. "Now we go forward no matter what," Dakota said grimly. "The mountain is waking up and it doesn't care who it crushes." They pressed on through air that tasted of dust and fear, following a passage that grew increasingly unstable with each step. Support timbers groaned ominously under the weight of centuries, while loose rock cascaded from the ceiling at the slightest disturbance. It was in this hellish landscape that they met their final test. The passage opened into a vast chamber where mining operations had intersected with a natural cave system, creating a space that defied easy description. Ancient stalactites hung like stone icicles from a ceiling lost in darkness, while the floor was pocked with mine shafts that dropped into unknowable depths. Wooden walkways, most of them rotted through connected scattered platforms where mining equipment still rusted in the eternal darkness. And there, waiting for them with the patience of a spider in its web, stood Captain James Aldrich with the remnants of his search party. "Welcome to your tomb, cousin," he said with cold satisfaction. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your way in the dark." Captain Aldrich stood on a platform of rotting timber, suspended over a mine shaft that dropped into darkness beyond the reach of lantern light. Behind him, 6 surviving members of his search party held rifles trained on the narrow passage where Serafina and Dakota had emerged, while more men presumably waited in the tunnels to prevent any retreat. "Quite a chase you've led us," Aldrich continued conversationally, as if they were meeting at a church social rather than in the bowels of a mountain honeycombed with death traps. "But it ends here in a place where 3 more unfortunate souls will be discovered weeks from now, victims of a tragic cave-in." Serafina felt Clara stirring against her chest, the baby sensing the tension that filled the cavern like poisonous gas. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere left to go, only stone walls and mine shafts that promised death in different equally final forms. "Why James?" she asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Matthew trusted you. He spoke of you as the brother he never had. Why did you have him killed?" Aldrich's laugh echoed off the stone walls like the sound of breaking glass. "Brother Matthew was a dreamer who believed the world could be improved through honest work and fair dealing. Noble sentiments, but hopelessly naive in a territory where fortunes are made by men willing to take what they need." He began moving along the treacherous walkway that connected his platform to the chamber floor, his men maintaining their aim while adjusting position to follow his movement. Each step sent small cascades of rotted wood into the abyssal depths below. "Your husband discovered communications that weren't meant for his eyes." Telegraph intercepts showing coordination between military operations and civilian interests, my interests. When he began asking inconvenient questions about mining claims and army contracts, he became a liability that needed to be eliminated. So you had him murdered in the mine collapse. I had him removed permanently. The method was simply convenient. Mining accidents are regrettably common in territories where safety regulations are more suggestions than requirements. Aldrich's pale eyes glittered in the lantern light. Though I confess the insurance company's refusal to pay his claim was perhaps unnecessarily cruel. A personal touch, you might say. The casual admission of murder struck Serafina like a physical blow, confirming what she had suspected, but hoped might somehow be untrue. Matthew had died not as a casualty of war or territorial conflict, but as the victim of family betrayal disguised as business necessity. And now you plan to kill us all. Dakota said quietly, his rifle trained on Aldrich, despite the hopeless odds. Another convenient accident to tie up loose ends. A tragic cave-in, as I mentioned. The renegade Apache, the deluded widow, and her unfortunate child, all victims of their own foolish attempt to hide in unstable mine workings. Aldrich had almost reached the chamber floor now, close enough for Serafina to see the cold calculation in his expression. The territorial authorities will mourn the loss of innocent lives, while breathing sighs of relief that troublesome questions died with the questioners. But even as he spoke, Serafina was studying the chamber with the analytical mind that Matthew had always admired. The support structures were ancient and rotten, held together more by habit than engineering. The platforms suspended over mine shafts swayed with every movement, while ceiling timbers groaned under stresses they were never designed to bear. More importantly, she could see what Aldrich's focus on his victims had prevented him from noticing small details that spoke of imminent catastrophe to anyone trained to recognize the signs. "James," she said quietly, "look around you. Really look. This chamber is about to collapse." Another delay tactic. Aldrich's smile was condescending. "I'm afraid I'm not impressed by." His words were cut off by a rumble that seemed to come from the mountain's very bones, followed by the sharp crack of stressed timber reaching its breaking point. Dust cascaded from the invisible ceiling while the walkways began swaying like bridges in a high wind. "The mountain's unstable," one of Aldrich's men shouted. "We need to get out of here now." But their captain was beyond reason, driven by obsession that had consumed whatever sanity he might once have possessed. "No, we finish this here and now, regardless of the cost." The confrontation that followed was less a battle than a dance with death performed on a stage that was actively trying to kill all the performers. Aldrich's rifle spoke first, the bullet passing so close to Clara that Serafina felt the heat of its passage. Her return shot from the Derringer took him in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Dakota's Spencer boomed in response to the heavy bullet taking one of Aldrich's men's center mass and sending him tumbling into a mine shaft with a scream that echoed long after he disappeared. But the recoil of the shot was enough to disturb the already precarious balance of the platform he stood on, sending him scrambling for new footing as rotten timber gave way beneath his feet. The chamber erupted in chaos as men fired at shadows, while fighting to maintain their balance on walkways that swayed and buckled with each movement. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning, while bullets ricocheted off stone walls, creating a deadly crossfire that claimed attackers and defenders alike. But it was the mountain itself that proved the most deadly enemy. Support timbers that had stood for decades finally surrendered to the inevitable, sending tons of rock cascading from the ceiling in an avalanche of stone and dust. The sound was indescribable, like the world ending in slow motion, accompanied by the screams of men who had come to commit murder and found themselves victims instead. Through the chaos, Serafina saw Aldrich struggling to maintain his footing on a platform that was slowly tilting toward the mine shaft it was suspended over. His rifle had been lost in the collapse, but his sidearm remained in his hand as he fought gravity and his own desperation. "This is your fault," he screamed over the roar of falling stone. "All of it could have been avoided if you just accepted what was inevitable." But even as he spoke, the platform gave way, entirely sending him plummeting into darkness with a final cry of rage and terror that was swallowed by the abyss. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the settling of dust and the occasional fall of loose stone, Serafina found herself pressed against Dakota in a pocket of space that had somehow remained intact. Clara was crying a sound more beautiful than any music, because it meant she was alive and unharmed. "Is it over?" Serafina whispered. "It's over." Dakota confirmed his voice, hoarse from dust and exhaustion. "Aldrich is dead, and his men are either buried or fled. The conspiracy dies with them." They picked their way carefully through the wreckage, following Dakota's memory of passages that might still be passable. Behind them, the chamber continued its slow collapse, erasing all evidence of the confrontation that had taken place in its depths. It took them 3 hours to reach daylight, emerging from a concealed entrance near the old stamp mill foundations like survivors of their own burial. The morning sun felt like a benediction on their faces, while the simple act of breathing clean air seemed like a miracle after the dust-choked atmosphere of the collapsing mine. "What happens now?" Serafina asked as they stood together in the ruins of Bitter Creek's abandoned mining operation. "Now we go home," Dakota replied, and something in his voice suggested he had finally found a place where that word had meaning again. Clara stirred in her mother's arms, opening bright eyes to study the world that had nearly claimed all three of them. But they had survived bound together by love, that had grown from desperate necessity into something far stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy them. The conspiracy was ended, and the debts were paid, and the future stretched before them like an unmarked trail leading toward whatever destiny they chose to build together. 1 year later, spring had returned to the valley of the San Pedro River, with a gentleness that seemed to heal the harsh memories of the previous autumn. The small log cabin that Dakota and Serafina had built together sat on a mesa overlooking water that ran clear and sweet, its windows catching the morning light like eyes opening to greet each new day with gratitude. Clara had grown into a bright, curious child who took her first steps on wooden floors her parents had insisted upon despite the extra expense. She spoke her first words in both English and Apache, calling equally for Mama and Papa when she needed comfort or wanted to share some small discovery that delighted her endlessly curious mind. The legal proceedings following the collapse at the mine had been surprisingly brief once territorial authorities realized the scope of Aldrich's conspiracy. With the captain's death and the recovery of documents that detailed his illegal operations, the case against Silas Vetch and his associates had been straightforward. The stolen assets were recovered and distributed to victims of the fraud, providing Serafina and Clara with financial security they had never expected to enjoy. More importantly, Dakota had been officially pardoned for his desertion and offered a position as government interpreter and scout between Apache communities and territorial government. It was work that took him away from home occasionally, but it was meaningful work that used his unique skills to prevent the kind of tragic misunderstandings that had cost so many lives. On this particular morning, as Serafina stood in their doorway, watching Dakota work with their expanding goat herd in the distance, she felt a familiar flutter of anticipation in her stomach. Today would mark another milestone in their journey from desperate strangers to chosen family. Dr. Monroe had ridden up from Tucson the previous evening, along with Miss Klein and several other friends who had supported them through the darkest times. They had come to witness the ceremony that would make their informal family arrangement a matter of legal record. A risk in a territory where mixed marriages faced legal and social obstacles, but a risk they had decided to take together. "Good morning, beautiful," Dakota called as he approached the cabin, carrying a pail of fresh milk that steamed in the cool air. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for months," Serafina replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "The question is whether you're prepared to be legally bound to a widow with strong opinions and a tendency to involve herself in other people's business. I fell in love with a woman who forged military communications to save children she'd never met," Dakota said, setting down the milk and lifting Clara from her basket. "I believe I can handle whatever opinions you might have." The word love no longer startled them. It had become as natural as breathing, shown through daily actions, and spoken with the confidence of people who had tested their commitment under the worst possible circumstances. "I love you too," Serafina said simply. "Both of you. More than I thought possible after Matthew died." Clara chose that moment to voice her own opinion on the proceedings, reaching toward both adults with chubby arms and babbling something that sounded remarkably like family in her mixture of languages. They laughed together, the sound echoing off the cabin walls like music celebrating their decision to bind their lives together, officially. The ceremony took place in the main room of their cabin, with Dr. Monroe performing the service, while their small circle of friends served as witnesses. Serafina wore her best blue dress, carefully altered to accommodate the changes that good food and happiness had brought to her figure. Dakota wore traditional Apache wedding attire, borrowed from his grandfather's brother, who had ridden down from the Chiricahua Mountains to bless their union according to tribal customs. "Do you, Serafina Aldrich, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." Her voice carried absolute conviction, strengthened by months of partnership, tested by mortal danger, and proven stronger than fear. "Do you, Dakota, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." His reply came in both English and Apache, linking two worlds in a single solemn promise that would bind them together through whatever years remained. When Dr. Monroe pronounced them husband and wife, according to the laws of Arizona Territory, Dakota kissed his bride with gentle reverence, while Clara applauded from Miss Klein's arms. The small cabin filled with congratulations and laughter, creating memories that would sustain them through whatever challenges their unusual marriage might face. That evening, after their guests had departed for the long journey back to their respective homes, the new family sat together on their front porch, watching the sun set behind the Dragoon Mountains. Clara slept peacefully in her father's arms, while her mother worked on a piece of embroidery. Home is where love lives, surrounded by carefully stitched desert flowers and soaring hawks. "Any regrets?" Dakota asked softly, his voice barely audible above the evening song of insects and distant coyotes. "None," Serafina replied without hesitation. "Not about the forged telegram, not about running into the mountains, not about marrying an Apache warrior who saved my baby's life. You? Only that it took us so long to make it official." He shifted Clara to a more comfortable position, still marveling at how completely this child had claimed his heart. "She's going to need brothers and sisters eventually." "In time," Serafina said, but her smile suggested the possibility was far from unwelcome. "Let's see how we manage with one remarkable daughter before we start planning for more." They talked quietly as the stars emerged overhead, making plans for expanding their goat herd and discussing Dakota's next assignment, mediating a water rights dispute between Apache families and territorial ranchers. It was the kind of ordinary, intimate conversation that married couples share throughout their lives together, made precious by the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. As the night deepened around them, Serafina reflected on the path that had led from desperate hunger in a mining camp tent to this peaceful evening surrounded by love and security. The memory of Clara's weak cries seemed like something from another lifetime. But she would never forget the terror of watching her daughter slowly starve, or the miracle of finding salvation in warm milk left by a stranger's compassionate hands. That stranger had become her husband, the father of her child, and the love of a second life she had never expected to have. Clara would grow up knowing two cultures, speaking two languages, and understanding that the world contained both cruelty and kindness in equal measure. Most importantly, she would know that her parents had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and family over the safety of remaining alone. Outside their cabin, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain that would bring new growth to the valley. Inside, three people who had found each other through desperate circumstances slept peacefully together, bound by love that had grown from necessity into something far stronger and more enduring than any of them had dared to hope. The widow no longer sat alone with a hungry baby, wondering if they would survive another day. She had found her family, built her home, and discovered that even in the harshest places, love could take root and flourish if tended with sufficient courage and care. As dawn approached over the San Pedro Valley, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold, and Rose Serafina, Takoda, stood at her window holding her sleeping daughter, while her husband prepared for another day of work that would help build a more just and peaceful territory. The future stretched before them, like an uncharted map full of possibilities they would explore together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of shared joy at a time. The circle was complete, the debts were paid, and the new family faced whatever came next with the confidence of people who had already survived the worst the world could offer, and emerged stronger, wiser, and infinitely more grateful for the simple miracle of waking up each morning surrounded by love.